Ladies and gentlemen, day 99 of the Russian invasion and the ninth year of the war by Russian Federation against Ukraine. My name is Andriy Shevchenko, and I'm welcome all the journalists that are communicating the truth about the Russia-Ukraine war. We will be talking about how we can improve the border crossing procedures on the Ukraine-Poland border. But first of all, I would like to invite Mr. Yurii Buchko, Deputy Head of Lviv Oblast Military Administration. Yurii, I have an urgent question because we know that yesterday the enemy inflicted a strike on the territory of Lviv region. You are right. Unfortunately, Lviv region was subjected to a missile strike, Sambyr in 3 districts. Some of the railway infrastructure was damaged. You might know that 5 people were injured. 4 of them are in moderate condition. They were hospitalized in the local hospitals. The railway connection has already been restored, so the trains continue running. Can we state that the enemy is targeting the railway infrastructure deliberately? I think so, because recently it's been like that. To what extent are such airstrikes a threat for the transportation taking place in Lviv region? I cannot really say that there will be a threat to transportation, but there are delays. If we have a look at the current situation, there was a delay of about 8 hours for both cargo and passenger transportation, but the Ukrainian Railways company is doing everything possible to restore the connection as soon as possible, so the trains are running again. But let's veer back to the topic that is the primary interest of our briefing today. Since there's no air service, there's no sea transportation, there's more strain on the Ukraine-Poland border. How is Lviv region responding to this situation, and what are you planning to do in the future to increase the throughput capacity of the border crossing points in Lviv region? I would like to point out that Lviv region has been trying to increase the number of border crossing points for several years, so including on the Ukraine-Poland border. Last year and this year, we've been creating new border crossing points. Nizhankovichi is a potential new border crossing point. There's work in progress there right now, and in the near future, that border crossing point will be open. I visited that site yesterday. The Polish contracting company is doing the works, so we will have a joint border checkpoint for both the Ukrainian and Polish customs that will facilitate the border crossing procedures. In the past several years, we've been also giving thought to some potential border crossing points in the mountain area, like in Chervonograd region. We contacted our Polish counterparts, and we have already constructed, or we are constructing, some new roads, Bobrka, Shanets, Belz in Chervonograd district. And there we want to construct some new border crossing points. In the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, some of the works were put on hold, including road construction works. But we need to continue living, we need to continue functioning under the current circumstances, and even under martial law, we have resumed some of the planned works. The Rava-Ruska border crossing checkpoint is in the works right now, because we want to make sure that our citizens will be able to freely cross the border. Practice of the first days of the war demonstrated that those people who do not have their own private vehicles want to cross the border by walking, and we have only one pedestrian border crossing point in the western section of the border. This is Shahini, and you might know that a lot of people cross the border on foot in the first days of the war. upwards of 80% of Ukrainian citizens are striving for EU membership. We want to become an EU member. We want to fully integrate into the European community. And without sufficient border crossing points, we will not be able to claim this EU membership. We are also actively working on railway services, cargo transportation in the first place. We are designing all required documentation to build a narrow gauge railroad to the town of Rava-Ruska and then from there to the city of Lviv. The government is also crafting a concept for building a narrow gauge railroad from Mostyska to Lviv. From Herov, the situation is the same. The Polish counterparts have already developed a design. It's 7 kilometers to the border, and in the future they are planning to restore the railroad there, and then from Herov we will design a railroad to the border. This is 23 kilometers because we want to facilitate the transportation of both cargo and passengers. We have only one section of the narrow gauge railroad, which is in Mostyska region. I would like to engage Mr. Danylo Menshikov, acting head of Lviv Customs Office. I would like to revert to the topic of Rava-Ruska. Why is that pedestrian border crossing point so important? And should we view it in the context of this large program for increasing the number of border crossing points on the Ukraine-Poland border? Good morning, everyone. The construction of the pedestrian border crossing point at the Rava-Ruska International Road border checkpoint has resumed. The preparatory work started several years ago, but because of the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown, because of the all-out Russian invasion of Ukraine, the works were put on hold, but all the registers are already in place. We have already obtained all required documents, and as of this week, we embarked on the active phase of construction, and we will accelerate this process. Why is this border crossing point so important? There are several factors that come into play. We can see definitely the significance of this border crossing point. As Yurii mentioned, before the war, we had only 6 border crossing points, and there was only 1 pedestrian. Since the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, we opened all the border crossing points to facilitate border crossing. So the need was there even before the war, and the need is still there. We also know that airports and seaports are blocked. So if Europeans and people from all over the world want to come to Ukraine, they can use only ground border crossing points. 6 of them are located in Lviv region within the area of responsibility of Lviv Customs Office. We also want to build a modern European border crossing point that will be in line with the inclusion criteria, and children, moms with pushchairs and prams will be able to cross it easily. At this checkpoint, we want to have a ramp, we want to construct additional bathroom facilities, and we want to honor all inclusion requirements. The cultural issue is on top of the agenda as well, because we know that next year Ukraine will be hosting the Eurovision Song Contest 2023, and Lviv Customs will be a gateway for European and global fans. We will be the face of our country. We can see that we will be able to bring this project to fruition within 7 to 8 months and have that border crossing point open by the Eurovision Song Contest 2023. We have the successful experience of the Euro 2012 football championship and also the Pope's visit, so we are sure that we will succeed. Are there any questions from the audience? Marta Baidaka, Tvoje Misto. What about the cost of this project? Because we know that such initiatives are quite costly. Where are you going to get the money from? And when are you intending to complete the works? In 1 year or longer? This project will be funded as part of the intergovernmental agreement between Poland and Ukraine, and it will be funded at the expense of the Polish grant funds, 1.5 million euros. This is the cost, and the intention is to complete the works within 7 to 8 months. Any other questions? Перший західний channel, you mentioned the topic of inclusion. Were you talking about the Rava-Ruska border crossing point? Exactly, that checkpoint will be in line with all the inclusion regulations and requirements. Another question, since the outbreak of the full-scale war, you said that all the border crossing points on the western border were able to let the people through by pedestrian avenues, right? Exactly, because in the first days of the war, we saw long lines of people at all border crossing checkpoints. And so the decision was made to let people cross all these checkpoints on foot. What about the current situation? Well, 4 out of 6, Kharkiv, Rava-Ruska, Sheheni, and one more. And there's a question to Yurii, if he's still here. I have a question about the narrow gauge railroad. Can you expand on this issue? Is this railroad already being constructed, or it's only in the works? Well, we're not really talking only about a narrow gauge railroad. We're talking about the European gauge railroad. In my opening remarks, I mentioned that we have a narrow gauge railroad only to Mostiska 2. This railroad is functional. There are some trains running there. The next direction is Rava-Ruska. Right now, we are designing required documentation for the reconstruction of the railway station and the railroad. The total length is about 8 kilometers, to the best of my memory. Within 1 month, the cost estimate documentation will be prepared for the reconstruction of the railway station and the railroad, and I really hope that in 1 month we will be able to commence the works. Warsaw-Rava-Ruska train used to run there, so this is the connection that we want to resume. The second direction is the Kyiv direction, Sambir district. In the past, there used to be a train running there, Przemyśl, Zahush, Kyiv. It reduces the distance for the Poles themselves, because they will not have to bypass about 6 kilometers. They will be able to pass the territory of Ukraine by transit. We don't really want to use this checkpoint only for transit. We want to have a full-fledged railway border crossing point there. What do we need to do to this end? We need to restore about 23 kilometers of the railroad, but we want to have the European gauge railroad there, 1435. So we have a railroad there from Kyiv to the border, but we want to extend the European gauge railroad to Kyiv, and potentially we can also have an extension to Sambir. The cost of this project is about 800 million hryvnias. We have already held multiple meetings in Poland, including with the Minister of Infrastructure of Poland. Next week, we will have another conference dedicated to the construction of railway border crossing points. The amount is hefty, especially under martial law, because right now we are investing billions of euros into weapons and armament. So hopefully, with the financial support of our Polish counterparts and European partners, we will be able to extend this European gauge railroad at least to Kyiv. And then by dint of investors' funds, we can continue the works because we can have a transportation hub there. We will be able to load and unload grain, fuel, and petroleum products there. There is a multitude of investors that have an avid interest in this project, so they are ready to invest money in the construction of these transportation hubs. But everyone is waiting for our decision on the restoration of the railroad itself. So once we have the railroad there, we will be able to grow the infrastructure. Any other questions? Please go ahead, but speak into a microphone. Good morning, Lena Abramova, Ukrainian Media Center. You mentioned that to ensure our deeper integration into the EU, there's a need for a large number of border crossing points. Are you planning to construct some new border crossing points from ground zero after Rava-Ruska? And I have a question about inclusion. I understand that the Rava-Ruska border crossing point will have good infrastructure, but are you planning to make other border crossing points more inclusive as well in the future? In terms of reconstruction, together with the Lviv Customs Office, we planned the reconstruction of two border crossing points, Sheheni and Krakovets. But during the wartime, we need to partially close them down. So if we close them down for reconstruction, it will not be really right, because we will not have good communication with Europe and the world, because basically the western section of the border is the only gateway that we have to Europe and the world, because there's no air service, there's no sea transportation. So unfortunately, we had to put this reconstruction project onto the back burner. But in my opening remarks, I mentioned that as part of the Great Construction program, we created and improved some border crossing points. Nezhankovichi, the Poles are already constructing a border crossing point there, and we also want to have Belarus and Urich, two more border crossing points in Chervonograd district. There was a question about the opening of new border crossing points. Maybe you have something to add there. And there was also a question about inclusion or inclusivity. Look here, we intend to reconstruct the existing border crossing points and construct some new ones as well. All the projects that will be launched will definitely incorporate some inclusion requirements, because we have European integration processes in the pipeline, and it's one of Europe's requirements, compliance with inclusion requirements. An intergovernmental working group was set up the day before yesterday, and once the government makes final decisions on the reconstruction or construction of border crossing points, I'm pretty much sure that all these initiatives will be translated into reality as soon as possible. So we are waiting for the decisions of our government. I have another question, if I may. What is the current state of play with the border crossings? What is the trend in comparison with February or early spring? In terms of humanitarian aid, there are several factors here. Humanitarian aid crosses the border without lines. We have special green corridors on both the Polish side and the Ukrainian side. Lviv customs officers and Lviv customs office are doing everything possible to make sure that humanitarian aid funnels into our country as soon as possible. In terms of fuel, this issue has already been reserved as well. Together with the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine and our Polish counterparts, we succeeded in organizing green corridors. Empty fuel tank vehicles go to Europe, and then on the way back, they cross the border into Ukraine based on an expedited procedure. As for cargo transportation and other things pertaining to economic recovery, we can see that the lines have reduced in the past several weeks, and these lines are more controllable right now. We reached some agreements with our Polish counterparts. We streamlined some of the procedures, so we are in constructive dialogue. And right now, we don't really have any major lines at border crossing points. Even if there are lines, they are controllable. Yurii, what is your take on the situation? I can add the following thing in terms of humanitarian cargoes. We can see that the volumes have dropped, which is natural. We cannot be dependent only on humanitarian aid. We need to reboot our economy. But you can still go to Europe and bring in humanitarian aid. The volume of humanitarian aid has plummeted, but we can see that there is an increasing number of requests for humanitarian aid delivery. We don't even have that much humanitarian aid as the number of requests for humanitarian aid delivery. Hundreds per day, maybe even more. Everyone claims that they want to cross the border to pick up and bring in humanitarian aid, but we do not really see that humanitarian aid crossing the border. So the Shlях system, the way system, was created not for leisure, not for tourism, not for business trips, only for the delivery of humanitarian aid, humanitarian cargoes, and military supplies. We had Yurii Buchko, deputy head of Lviv Oblast Military Administration, and Danyil Menshikov, acting head of Lviv Customs Office, with us. Our next briefing will start at 11:30, and